Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And you've heard this from me before, but most of the guests come out of articles that appear in my Google alerts because somebody takes the time to write a really detailed article. But if it's on a niche topic, a lot of times people don't see it. It doesn't really get published and talked about anywhere. So there was an article that came up a couple weeks ago which was called Unarresting School Safety. And it was in the Nevada Law Review Journal. And I have never had a lawyer on this show before. I don't think I've ever talked about kind of a law review article in detail, but this was one that really struck out. So the guest today on the show is Professor Mariam Aranjani. She is a professor at the Boyd School of Law at UNLV. Mariam, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, David.
So this is a really detailed kind of law policy article. But what I think is interesting before we get into that is this is a topic that actually you have a personal connection to and a lot of personal investment in. Would you mind starting off by kind of talking about who you are and why the idea of school safety matters so much to you?
Absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about um, a really tragic incident on May 20th of 1988. I was an 11-year-old sixth grader at the time on that day, and I have two younger sisters that were still enrolled at the Hubbard Woods Elementary School in suburban Winnetka, Illinois, just north of Chicago. And on that day, a young woman named Lori Dan entered the school, the elementary school, went to a second grade classroom and um, shot some students there. Unfortunately, little boy, 8-year-old Nicky Corwin, lost his life, and 5 others were injured. And as and sort of what others who have experienced these school violence episodes know is, all of a sudden everyone sort of panicking. What do we do? Schools go into lockdown. The community goes into lockdown. Um, and I remember that day. I was old enough to remember. I was almost 12. And I remember the response of the adults, very well-intentioned adults, who immediately implemented all these security measures right after, like metal detectors and police officers at all the district schools, et cetera. And because it was a well-resourced community, we also had lots of mental health supports that came in to help children and adults affected by the shooting. Anyway, so I just, right for the end of that school year, there was about another month left of school. We had all those very intense interventions in the schools. And then starting in September, when we returned to school, all of those had evaporated, I think, in recognition of the fact that, I can only surmise this as an adult, but that, those measures wouldn't probably stop most shooters. And furthermore, are harmful to people in the community in lots of different ways. So anyway, but that experience stuck with me. I continued to study education policy through college, and went to law school really thinking about how to make schools safer and more joyous and thriving places of learning, and have dedicated my career as a lawyer and as an academic to that cause.
And it's just a reminder hearing about that shooting in 1988. That's a year before the Stockton shooting in Southern California. That's 11 years before Columbine. There's this thought that something is new or something is different or society is in a different place than it was. But in 1988, something that could have happened in 1998 or 2008 or 2018 or maybe 2028, that same story and same type of event and same type of response keeps playing out. And ultimately, we're not doing things that really make a lot of meaningful efforts, but we are doing things that do have actual impacts, many of which are actually harmful impacts. And I think that that's what your paper really touches on, is we need to understand the consequences of the way that schools are policed and the way that student discipline is treated.
That's exactly right, David. I mean, study after study, expert after expert has identified, you know, one, serious mental health needs that many of us have, including school shooters. And secondly, the wide accessibility of guns in our society. Those two things, unfortunately, mean that we will continue to see incidents all over society, not just in schools. And what I try to focus on in this piece and in several others that I've written is the sort of consequences, especially from a legal and constitutional standpoint for children. So, I look at the, relative to the relatively unlikely uh, or the relative unlikelihood that mass shooting will occur in a school, or really any kind of shooting will happen in a school, relative to the 50 million children that go to school every day, to 95,000 schools across the country, and the fact that we really have had hundreds during this last 25-year period of shootings, which is not insignificant. It's important. We need to focus on how to prevent those. But what I argue is that we have research that tells us what will be more likely to lead to better outcomes and avoid the harmful outcomes of increasing the school to prison pipeline, making schools feel unsafe rather than safe and positive places with climates that are welcoming and warm for children to learn in. So I've identified some of those harmful effects of our interventions in this article and in several others before it.
Before we get into the details of that article, you've mentioned constitutional law a couple times. What is your expertise within the law, and what kinds of courses do you teach at UNLV?
Sure. So I have been teaching for over 20 years. I've been a law professor for over 20 years, and I've taught constitutional law, criminal procedure, and education law. And my scholarship, one area of scholarship that I focus on, or the writing that I focus on, is the intersection of constitutional law, criminal law, and education. So, in other words, I study the constitutional rights of young people while they're in schools. So, to what extent do they enjoy, for example, Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure in the school context, or the right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment in the school context, or their right to be entitled to due process under the 5th and 14th Amendments in the school context. And so those are some of the areas I've focused in terms of my analysis of cases and other sources of law.
And there's some common misconceptions, which I've heard repeatedly throughout the last few years, where uh, police officials and school officials will say, actually, we can search every student without needing probable cause because the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to students. That's something that I've heard police officials say repeatedly, but it sounds like that's not actually the case.
That is absolutely not the case. In a seminal Supreme Court decision called New Jersey versus TLO, the Supreme Court decided over 40 years ago that students do enjoy Fourth Amendment rights in public schools. So, in other words, they have a right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure in schools. Now, in the regular context, and even those same children in another context would be entitled to a level of suspicion by police called probable cause. And in the school context, the court in that New Jersey versus TLO case said that instead the standard is reasonable suspicion. So it's a little bit lower of a standard that would justify a search because of the special needs circumstance of the schools where school officials are acting in loco parentis, or in the place of parents. So they have a heightened need for keeping kids safe in school. But they do still generally have to, for individualized searches, they do have to have reasonable suspicion or articulable facts to justify searching or seizing a student.
And just to go down this rabbit hole a little bit, because I think this is actually really important and topical before we get into your paper. It's summertime now, where schools are making a lot of plans for their upcoming year. There are a lot of school officials and teachers and parents groups who listen to this podcast. So they may be weighing in on some of these choices. A lot of schools now have mandatory backpack searches and screenings as soon as students enter the building. And it's not a voluntary screening because to enter, you have to be screened. And a lot of that is saying we're looking for weapons. Well, first, is a blanket screening like that constitutional? And second, if you're looking for weapons and the person conducting the screening finds a wad of cash or finds a vape or an e-cigarette or some marijuana, is that now something that this student can be suspended or expelled or disciplined or arrested for?
Sure. Um, so if you notice when I mentioned that case, New Jersey versus TLO, I talked about individualized searches. So in other words, if they target a particular student, there has to be reasonable suspicion to believe that student has committed crime or is going to commit crime. Okay, now, but in terms of suspicionless searches, in other words, blanket searches like the ones you described, um, the Supreme Court has decided two cases in which they have allowed for example, policies where students engaged in athletics after school can be subject to random drug testing, for example, or students involved in the second case was about students involved in extracurricular activities after school, generally, not just athletics. Can they be subject to a policy or required to sign a waiver submitting themselves to random drug testing? And again, the Supreme Court said that could be justified. But that said, I think these are very much questions that school communities should think about. I mean, if there's a sense that the blanket screenings are harmful to students and are not yielding the kinds of results that they want, and I'm happy to talk more about that policy aspect of it. In other words, whether they're yielding the kind of results that they want. I they should absolutely be having those conversations in school board meetings. Those are very much ripe for discussion. Blanket screenings are not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Unfortunately, we've seen that happen in society at large, where, for example, to enter airports or courthouses or other sort of unique circumstances, like I mentioned, where there's a special need for security, we have largely waived our expectation of privacy, which is what has to be in place before someone can argue that there has been a Fourth Amendment violation. So we have to have an expectation of privacy. So basically, we've gotten to the point where we've made a presumption of waiving that, or children have waiving that right in entering schools, just like entering into airports. You can't opt out of a TSA screening because we've just said you don't have an expectation of privacy in those settings. But again, those are very much something that could change if a district wanted to. And I've known, school officials across the country who have rejected those kinds of searches as being time consuming, as not yielding the kind of results they're looking for. I'll give you an example. And I wrote a piece in 2017, a law review article called The Prisonization of America's Public Schools, where I described my work with a program called the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project. And I was a teacher, a constitutional law teacher through that project at a public high school in Washington, D.C., where I lived for many years. And it took so much time every morning to enter the school. Children would stay outside in the freezing cold, lining up, waiting to get in the building. And then they knew how to get around the metal detectors. So even though there was that one entrance that you could get through, they would figure out other entrances. Someone would get in and open the door for a kid to come in another way. Or, for example, I was told by my own students that if you're in a wheelchair, you're not required to go through the metal detector. And so they could stash a weapon under a child's, or on the possession of a child who was in a wheelchair, etc. I mean, there are other ways to get around it. So I guess the real it's not that we want weapons in schools, not at all, but everything's a balance, right? We're trying to balance the costs and benefits of different decisions to make sure that they're actually achieving the goals we're trying to achieve.
Well, it's fascinating that was an article about the prisonization, because when students are screened every single day going into a secure facility with one door and fences around the campus, they are essentially being treated like the prisoners there in that school. And if you speak to anyone who's been in a correctional setting, The prisoners who are there every single day know the facility and know the weaknesses and have time to think
Yeah.
about it. And you talk about the students bringing the gun in through the wheelchair. I've looked at cases where, in one case, there was a fight inside the fence at a school playground, and the kids are fighting. Another kid who had been expelled from the school was outside of the fence line, and he tossed a gun over to his friend. So you had a failure by expelling a kid because that didn't keep him from being around the perimeter of the campus and interacting with all the kids through the rest of the day, and bringing a gun to the edge of the school campus. And all of that school security didn't prevent somebody from tossing a gun over the fence. Another one of those cases that stuck out, just because kids are so smart, yet we don't give them any agency. We don't treat them like they have constitutional rights. We don't treat them like they are um, active participants in the school, but rather the prisoners that need to be shuffled around. Is there was a planned shooting at a school, and the kids involved threw a backpack with guns on top of the roof. And then they went through the metal detector, and one climbed out of a window to go get the guns off the roof. So we can't apply this really simple thought to the school that, okay, we just have one door and it has a metal detector and it has a guard. Now everything is going to be perfect in there, because you're making the students feel like they're not safe. You're making the students feel like they're not on the same side as the staff, that you have now a division. And you can really easily defeat any of these things, and that creates this whole false sense of security.
That's exactly right. And those are great examples to highlight the same point. And I just want to, to connect with the constitutional question you were asking me earlier. The reason I called, well, this idea of the prisonization of schools occurred to me when I just watch over time. I've been working with that Marshall Brennan project, helping to start chapters of that project all over the country, where law students are teaching high school students about their constitutional rights. So I have seen over the last 27 years or so that I've been associated with that project. I've seen how schools have become exactly as you described, just secure facilities, and they're even designed now to look like prisons. I mean, the blueprints for most new schools that are designed are modeled after prisons.
I mean,
And there's a
there's
wonderful book
a
about that.
big company that I went down the rabbit hole of looking at the architect who is designing some of the big mega campuses. And on their website, they said they use panopticon theory
Yes, yes,
to design schools, which, for
yes,
anybody that doesn't know, is a completely failed design from corrections in the early 1800s. The panopticon was the idea that you put a guard in the center of a big circular prison, and the guard can look at any one of the cells at any time. So the prisoners are going to behave because they might always be watched. An enormous waste of space, a flawed theory of its design, and ultimately it didn't work. Yet 300 years later, school architects are selling panopticon theory as the way that they're designing schools.
exactly, exactly. I mean, we just are not. And there's a lot of money interests involved in this. I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that, to not just assume that our leaders are making decisions based on evidence, right? That they're being lobbied by people who are making a lot of money off of these decisions. Um, but so, to relate back to that idea of, I love that you mentioned the panopticon approach, to designing schools. And so all of that led me to think about the idea that there's a case called Ingram versus Wright, you might be familiar with, or some of your listeners maybe, in which the Supreme Court decided that students do not have Eighth Amendment rights to be free from corporal punishment in schools under the Cruel and Unusual Punishment Clause, um, because schools are not prison or prison like circumstances, which is where they had previously applied the Eighth Amendment. So I purposely called my article Prisonization of Public Schools to make the argument that, okay, well, maybe that's not the case anymore. That schools actually now do look and feel like prisons. And because they do, we ought to think about the application of the Eighth Amendment and protection against cruel and unusual punishment, in other words, corporal punishment, to students. And some examples of that in terms of concrete practices are restraint and seclusion, as we know, is unfortunately still very, very prevalent in our schools across the country. And we know that that practice is harmful to children. It's harmful to other children who watch that happening to their peers. Um, and then there's still, the sort of in some states, it's still permissible for an adult to physically punish a child in school, and in fact, it's welcome in some communities. So anyway, I think there are many ways in which the Constitution intersects with, and to the extent that we think of public schools as the place to train our future citizens, our future voters, our future jurors, our public officials, our judges, all the people that are going to be involved in promoting our democracy, that we ought to be, instead of imposing practices that are intended to suppress them, we ought to be promoting their opportunity to learn about their rights, to learn about the way in which the rule of law works and should work.
And that is important because, as you mentioned at the start of this, there are more than 50 million kids that go to 98,000 schools. I record about 300 shootings a year, which means that there are, still over 50 million kids in schools who are doing the right thing every day, who want to be in the school, who want to learn, who are going to graduate. And every one of them shouldn't be treated like they're the next school shooter. Every one of them shouldn't have to wear a clear backpack displaying all of their belongings or stand in an hour-long metal detector line every morning. That we're realizing that a very rare, small number of misbehaviors are shaping the way that the entire school community is treated. And when that's happened in the public, adults have really not tolerated that. I mean, that was stop and frisk in New York City
Yeah,
and saying that we are going to, doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're walking down this street, the police can throw you on the ground and arrest you. And adults do not tolerate that. We're seeing that now with immigration enforcement and the number of people that are coming out and marching. But students don't have the agency and the way and the place to say that we're not going to take this. And when they have, it just kind of gets laughed off. There have been some pretty significant student movements after shootings in schools, where all of the high school students have marched out of a school or out of a district to march to the state house. Um, but it does not get the same attention as when adults do it, because our patriarchal society, we think that, they're just kids being kids.
that's exactly right. And, David, I've had an opportunity to talk to lots of different types of stakeholders in public schools about my research. And I think the one takeaway I would urge people to think about is that school boards are the single most powerful force in American education. They really have the power to make um, uh, most important decisions, including hiring and firing of superintendents, who then hire and fire all the principals and staff at the schools in their districts. And all sorts of curricular and other policy decisions flow from school boards. So, to the extent that people are thinking, listening to all this and thinking, wait, yeah, I have a, I don't think this is right, what's happening. I want to do something. I think it's really important for them to focus their energy on who is on their school board and how can they educate those folks about what safety really means. I mean, I love what you said, David, about, and I agree that, you know, basically 50 million children every year are treated like they are either presumptive criminals or in a school with lots of other criminals present among their peer group. And I think the important thing to remember there is that they have other safety needs that are going unaddressed. Millions of children are food insecure, have housing instability, have mental health, challenges and needs, et cetera. I mean, there are many other ways. And in this recent article, I really define safety broadly, pursuant really to what the National Association of School Psychologists has recommended. Because I think if we really care about children and keeping them safe, let's talk about what it is, the ways in which they actually are not safe on a much more widespread basis. And that includes the ways I just mentioned.
And, to pull that thread, you made the point that, your Fourth Amendment right doesn't apply for blanket searches in a place where there's no expectation of privacy. But that's been flipped on its head in a lot of school security measures, because when you point at risks, the chance of a kid being victimized or sexually assaulted by either a classmate or a school staffer are significantly higher than the chance of them being shot in a school. Yet all over the country, we've put deadbolts and windowless doors
Yeah.
onto private spaces, closets, classrooms, and schools. We've created completely private areas where people can be victimized, and not thought about that in the whole risk continuum, that wait a second, this could happen to kind of any kid in this school probably many times a school year, and we're creating an environment for that. Meanwhile, we're also searching all these kids' backpacks because we're saying everybody might be prisoners. So we're applying like two mixed theories that are completely devoid of like a risk calculation between them.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's, yeah, I I'm grateful to have this conversation with you and hope that there are some folks listening who might be thinking about this really differently, because I think, after 9/11, so after 9/11, I think that was a real turning point in American society with regard to our expectation of privacy and our willingness to kind of give up privacy in the name of security, on a more widespread societal level that has trickled down into schools. And of course, now, in 2025, if you were born after 9/11, or even if you were young when it happened, you don't remember what it was like before schools had metal detectors and police officers and, other measures that we've described. And so I think it's important for us to have these conversations and to remind ourselves that, there, um, it's not that there aren't risks for gun violence in schools. There certainly are. But again, how do we most effectively address those things? It's not through clear backpacks and metal detectors and all of that. It's, let's get serious about gun possession and gun prevalence in our society. And let's also really manage the emotional wellness crisis that we have, not just as adults, but very much so for many children across the country.
And a big focus of your article is on school policing. And I think that that ties into post 9/11, where, I was somebody that worked in the Homeland Security enterprise for most of my career, and saw the way that it's grown. And then now, 20 years later, or 25 years later, we're facing the reality that actually having a massive federalized police force that can kind of do whatever it wants without a lot of oversight and enormous resources ends up being a bigger detriment than benefit. And that's kind of happened at the micro level in schools where, 30, 40 years ago, the largest school districts have had police departments back to, the 1940s and 50s, but it wasn't common for your suburban or rural school to have a police department. And if they were, it was an officer with a button-up uniform and a shiny belt and shiny shoes and a handgun. Uh, School policing has now really transformed into very highly resourced departments that are militarized in a lot of ways. They have all kinds of technology. They have social media monitoring. They have facial recognition technology. They have lots of officers that are in and out of schools, so you don't really know who's going where or what they're doing, or people from multiple agencies. But that has a direct impact on students, not just by the visible uh, school climate, but what those interactions with law enforcement have for what would have been pretty minor disciplinary issues. I think that's one of your big points in here, is we need to understand what the presence of police in schools does to students.
That's exactly right, David. I mean, of course, any principal or school leader who feels there needs to be some presence of security in schools, should have the freedom. They know best their school community. Of course, someone like you or I is not in their shoes. Um, but what you describe is sort of this per, pervasive, um, large scale, serious financial investment in having armed, trained police officers embedded or present on site in public schools on a regular basis in a way that has serious repercussions. And I do talk about that in the article because I think many people don't know that, I teach my students in criminal procedure that asking a police officer not to find crime is like telling a dog not to use its nose. I mean, that's what they do. That's what they're trained to do. That's what they, uh, you know, sort
Are
of have spent
mandated
their
to
whole
do.
exactly. So any behavior that seems like it could be related to a criminal offense is going to be interpreted as a criminal offense by a person who's trained to do that. And when they have a weapon and the ability to arrest someone, that triggers a chain of events that has lifelong consequences. I found a study in working on this article that shows that children who have just one suspension in K through 12 education have a greater likelihood of later criminality and participation in the criminal legal um, system than those who have not had a single suspension. And that's, an out of school suspension. And so, the problem, and we know that schools that have police officers on site have higher rates of suspensions and expulsions and other harsh disciplinary interventions. Again, not through that's the role of police officers, right? Is to find and treat what they view as crime with more serious responses than educators do. And so I
For
think,
things that
yeah,
traditionally a school would have handled on their
exactly,
own, because
exactly,
technically some of these things are crimes. If a kid is selling vape pens in the bathroom, it
yeah,
technically is a crime. If somebody vandalizes something, technically you can charge them with a crime there. And then some really petty stuff, which I think you've noticed, like, a kid picks up a pair of headphones that weren't theirs but were left in the hallway, and all of a sudden they're being hit with felony theft because of the cost of the item. All of that stuff could get handled internally within the school environment, and you could have either restitution or education or some sort of suspension. As soon as a police officer is involved, now it's formal criminal justice intervention.
that's exactly right. And I think what I want to add another important um, research point here, which is that we now know how our brains develop. We didn't have all this research about the developing young brain until the last couple of decades, and now we know that our prefrontal cortex is not fully formed until our mid-20s. So sometimes we look at a teenage boy, especially a young boy of color, and we see physically somebody who looks older than they may be chronologically. And so we assume that they understand the consequences of their behavior in a way that they simply don't. They can't. Their brains have not fully formed yet. And so, for those who think that you or I might be arguing for, less serious interventions when there are instances of someone selling vape pens or stealing from a classmate, that type of thing, I think that it's important to really quickly explain also that the reason we used to leave those decisions up to educators is that they understand better how young people learn and how they will, um, grow and not engage in that kind of behavior without imposing serious punishments on them through no fault of their own in their brain development. They don't understand the long-term consequences of their behavior. They don't understand, exactly what, I don't want to say right from wrong, but I mean, they don't understand exactly in the moment what a decision. They're more suggestible. They're more likely to be influenced by peers, et cetera. There are lots of ways in which we can't look at the behavior in which they engage in the same way as we would look at an adult engaging in that behavior.
But on the adult side too, I feel like with taking minor disciplinary issues and elevating them into criminal charges, adults also don't have a clear goal of either what you're trying to accomplish or what the impacts of that decision is going to be for the way that you treat and charge a student potentially. Because say you have a kid who's, selling vape pens in the bathroom, you decide to arrest them and you have a zero tolerance policy at school, so there's an automatic expulsion. So now there's a kid who's dealing with the juvenile justice system, and you have a kid who's expelled from school.
Right.
Neither of those things are going to get them on the right track if the wrong path was selling vape pens. So now you have a kid who's out of school and is putting a huge strain on their family if they even have one. That's going to push them further down the path of probably successive crimes, which you see with your study that it's a strong correlate to have that suspension and then go on to be a lifetime criminal offender. The fundamental tenet of like the criminal justice system is either there's a dangerous person that we need to remove from society. The most dangerous people would have life in prison where they're never going to get out. There's also the concept that somehow serving time in prison is going to be punishment to you. So you did a wrong, you're going to sit in prison for a certain amount of time, and that punishment is going to teach you to never do that again. And the third is that the criminal justice system is supposed to um, rehabilitate somebody. That you go to jail for 10 years, you're being rehabilitated in prison, and you're going to come out better than you were. Well, for a young kid who gets arrested for a minor offense in school, they're not this horrible danger to society who needs to be, locked away to protect us. They're not really learning a lesson by now being expelled from school. Like, oh, wait, now I have no future. What lesson am I learning? And you're certainly not rehabilitating them because they're not going to come out better from the process than they were at the start. So what are we even doing here?
I couldn't agree more. I think, we have to understand, again, that we're dealing with young people who are still forming their identities. So if we treat them like they're criminals, why wouldn't they just continue to behave like criminals? As you point out, I think, I want to raise some data points that come up a little bit in the article, but that I think help you understand why I've chosen to focus on school psychologists as a evidence-based investments that make more sense for student safety than school police do. So we know, so the National Association of School Psychologists recommends a ratio of one school psychologist for every 500 children. And the average school district in the United States has a ratio of more than double that, 1 to 1,027. In some districts, it's as high as 1 to 5,000. And these are folks that are trained to understand and ask questions. Why did you choose to make that decision? What is it that, and to ask, again, around the basic safety. Are you getting enough food? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you living in a secure place? And to try to connect those children who say no to any one of those questions to resources that will better address their real needs, and lead to more successful, as you say, rehabilitative outcomes than punitive outcomes that just treat them and train them to engage in that same kind of behavior and thought pattern when they get older.
Yeah, and most school police officers are somewhere in the cost of $100,000 to $200,000 a year, even more depending on the type of equipment that they have. And I mean, this is kind of a broader point about what we prioritize in society, but your standard licensed mental health provider, or licensed counselor, or licensed psychologist, a lot of those salaries are 40,000, 50,000. So you could have 2 to 4 licensed counselors for every one police officer in a school. And if you look at that ratio of 1 to 500, how much better can students be if you have a 1 to 100 ratio, and a kid who really needs help can be seeing that person every single week or multiple times a week, and other students can be having a depression screening or a domestic violence screening or just a wellness check-in with somebody once a month. And that's just your licensed mental health providers, we've seen huge amounts of success across the country with community violence interrupters. And that's where you have volunteers who aren't even paid. They can be parents, they can be older siblings who don't have full-time work, or things who are there in the school to interact with students and try to diffuse conflicts. And the last point there, one of the very first episodes that I recorded more than a year ago was with the former head of the National Association of School Nurses. A nurse can do all of these things
Yes,
also,
yes, yeah.
while potentially being the only healthcare provider that students in low income neighborhoods are seeing every year.
That's great. Yeah, I hoped in this article just to open in at least in the sort of law scholarship space to think about who are partners in this real effort to address student safety. And so I started with school psychologists in this piece because I had an opportunity to work with them through some programming and learn more about what their roles are and what their professional obligations are with regard to school safety. They feel very strongly that they have an obligation to advocate, and they're pursuant to their own enforceable obligations as professionals to interrupt violence that's being committed against them by school employees, including school police officers, and also on a widespread level. So they have an obligation. For example, their ethical obligations require that if they see that children are waiting outside, for example, in a low income community where children may not have appropriate outerwear and they're standing outside in the cold for half an hour waiting to get into the school, they have an opportunity and really an obligation to intervene and go to the leadership of the school and of the district even and say, hey, this is creating some harms here. Children are going to get sick because they're waiting outside trying to get into the building. With these metal detector lines. Anyway, so there are some really important partners there in the school psychology. But as you point out, I love the idea of working with nurses and school social workers and school counselors. Um, I'll just say school psychologists are a little bit more expensive. Their salaries tend to be on average about the same as school resource officers, at least according to whatever data we can gather, which there isn't great data about that particular group. But
Yeah, my
but
mistake there. I think I was
that's okay.
thinking of licensed social workers.
Yeah, social workers. Yeah, their salaries are a little bit lower. Yeah. Um, yeah.
And the point
So
that you make about students waiting outside, I mean, that just gets overlooked. That's one of the most common time periods for a shooting on campus. And you're if you have kind of the prisonized school where everything is going to be locked down until we've got the TSA line ready to go and students can start coming in. And there was a shooting on the front steps of a school in Texas at 6:50 in the morning because there are 100 kids waiting on the steps because the door doesn't open until 7, and there's no school resource officer out there because their shift doesn't start until 7 when the door opens. But if you had the school as a more welcoming environment, then those kids are all over the campus. They're all over the inside and the outside of the school. They're in the cafeteria, they're in the band room, they're in the hallways. And then you probably don't have the shooting that happens on the front steps at all because there's not this congregation point where conflict arises every morning as a bunch of grumpy kids are standing outside in the cold for an hour. We're not thinking about this either from the student's point of view or from creating a welcoming community point of view.
that's exactly right. I mean, if we step back for a second and just think about the ways in which the government interacts with us in our lives, public schools are the number one place where almost all of us can relate, right? We either have attended public schools ourselves or we have a loved one, our own child, or someone else who we know who's attended public schools. I mean, these are places that should be the most welcoming, the most um, um, positive places as far as developing identity, developing connection to one another, connection to community. And instead, unfortunately, we've taken the exact opposite approach in the name of trying to keep children safe.
And we need to get our return on investment. because when you look at local municipal budgets, the local public school system is the largest expense on the municipal budget for almost every community across the entire country. Because we're saying if kids are between 4 years old and 18 years old, they're going to spend 8 hours of their day or more in this building. And we need teachers and lunches and custodians and lights and technology and facilities. It's expensive. We are putting a vast amount of our public resources into this place that we shouldn't do something to sabotage the effectiveness of it and to sabotage the way that students view it and then the way that they view the law and policing and regulation and the government then for the rest of their lives.
That's exactly right. And on the in fact, I think it's helpful to step back and just think about every human can stop and think about, regardless of what our family circumstances are. And many of us have traumatic or, not so positive family lives. And so if we just think about what if we had to spend 8 or more hours a day in one place, in one building, what would we want that place to feel like? How would we want to feel in that place? And how do we create those places then of love and care and excitement for learning, love for learning? And I think we can then see how what you describe as campuses that are accessible, right? That are open rather than um, completely sort of restricted and carefully monitored. That's contrary to what the spaces that we all would love to be in.
Yeah, I think about, my time working in different Department of Homeland Security agency buildings, and you go to this extremely sterile 1960s era brutalist federal building. It has guards at the front door. You have to badge in. You might have to go through a metal detector, even though you're going through that gate every single day. You go inside. It's nothing but fluorescent lights and cubicles. The only thing on the wall is, a portrait of the president and a portrait of the DHS secretary and maybe some, plaque from some award somebody got 20 years ago. It's not a space that inspires anybody. But then you walk into a university building, and almost every university building is huge windows, big atriums, artwork in the entryways, color, lights. Classrooms have all of these design features to make sure that people can see each other and talk, and good acoustics, and all of these little congregation spaces with sofas and benches and desks and shared spaces that people feel, at least I feel, inspired, when you walk into a university building. And you feel like your soul is being crushed when you walk into a government building. And we have a choice as adults to decide which one of those feelings kids are going to have each day.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think, we're all well intentioned. These are not, I think hopefully what we've discussed here today feels like an opportunity for all of us to step back and just think again about where, our own spaces and what we want for our children. I mean, I view every child as my own. I just do. And I wish that we could all try to do that, right? Like, what if I want my child to be in a safe classroom and an inspiring space, then I want other children to have the same. And so, how can I do that in whatever small way, whether I'm a teacher, administrator, or parent, or just community member? How can I advocate for that in my own community? I hope folks can walk away from this conversation just thinking about that.
So for the last point here is, it's the middle of summer now. Towards the end of summer, probably August, September, you're going to have your first big school board meeting in almost every community around the country. What would you want a parent to know about that school board meeting, and then to stand up and talk about their what are the actionable things that somebody can bring up to start improving the school community and climate?
Sure. Well, I think any parent should be able to access, now meetings from prior um, minutes from prior meetings are accessible online. You can search for them pretty easily just to find out what conversations have happened already about school safety. And just educate yourself a little bit walking into the first meeting about what are the priorities of the district, what are some of the concerns. Another place to look for research. Many of us, don't really closely look at the handbooks that school districts produce that include the rights of children, and include provisions about their Fourth Amendment rights and their freedom of speech rights, etc. So just educate yourselves a little bit about what it is that are some of the sort of tensions or questions you might have, and then make your voice heard. Show up and say, I want my child to attend a beautiful school, a welcoming school. I want my child to attend a school that is forgiving, that is looking for causes of behavior rather than punishment of behavior, or harsh punishment of behavior. And I always encourage people to, if you don't see the kind of leadership on your school board that you would like to see, then maybe you're the next person who needs to run for the school board. Those are positions that often are filled by folks. I think we're often surprised to know who is on the school board, and that would be an important thing. Also, I would advise your listeners to think about is do some research about who is on your school board. In many places, it's folks that have a financial stake in the decision making of the district. So people who have real estate interests or other kinds of interests, often are on school boards. People who maybe never had any interaction with the school district as a parent, as a child themselves, could be on the school board. So if you're a former teacher or anyone else, a parent, somebody who's got some real personal experience, you could be somebody who could run yourself for the school board. But of course, start by just making your voice heard and see what the reactions are and see if you can build a coalition of like-minded community members to advocate for the kinds of treatment of your children that you think are appropriate.
And just a couple episodes ago, I had the founder of Grandparents for Gun Responsibility, and I think her motto was so powerful that all you need to do is get out, stand up, speak up. The first step is just get out of your house and just show up at one of those school board meetings. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to do anything, but just be there and see what's going on. If you feel like you've got a little more energy on the topic, you stand up and you actually show that you're here. You make people realize that this is what you're doing and standing for. And finally, and it takes the most courage, is then speak up and say what you want to change, say where the problems are, say where there can be a better environment.
Yes,
Everybody
I love
can
that
do
too.
that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's so inspiring. And I think there's a lot of available research for people who are interested in advocating for different approaches to tap into. And so school people have contacted me, for example, and other colleagues that I have to say, hey, our school district is thinking about hiring more police officers, and we don't think that's the right thing to do. What can we do to convince others? I personally am happy to send research or share research on that point, and I'm sure you as well have great conversations and opportunities to educate people. So there are lots of resources available to.
Absolutely. Well, I will make sure that your contact info is in the show notes, as well as a link to your paper. That is Unarresting School Safety. It's an article from the Nevada Law Journal. So thank you so much for your time. The guest today was Professor Mariam Aranjani from the Boyd School of Law at UNLV. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.